Well, welcome back, everybody. So now we're going to listen to three very interesting presentations. The first is, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Ajila.
It's Ajla.
Isla. Okay, sorry, Isla, who will be looking at exploring genocide narratives through English literature. So over to you, Isla. Thank you.
Introduction. So today we will delve into the intersection of genocide education and English literature. We'll explore how literary texts can serve as powerful tool for understanding and teaching about the complexities of genocide. Goals of this presentation and my speech are to highlight the importance of genocide education, examine the role of literature, um, also discuss effective pedagogical approaches. By utilizing literature, we as educators try or aim to humanize historical events, fostering deeper emotional and intellectual engagement with the subject matter. So the power of literature in genocide education, as we know, literature has a very unique ability to humanize historical narratives and amplify marginalized voices. It encourages empathy, ethical engagement, deeper understanding of human experiences during times of extreme violence. By studying literature, students can connect emotionally with the subject matter, fostering a more profound understanding of genocide, war, or any topic that's presented. Literature also helps students see beyond statistics, numbers, dates, allowing them to grasp the personal and emotional aspects of historical events. Um, Now, literature pieces overview. As I was the student of literature, especially in the masters, we discussed numerous works dealing with war, crimes, migration, and genocide. Uh, as I studied international university, we tried to implement or tried to learn about different cultures, and these works presented here on the slide are just some of the key literary pieces. So in the presentation, I'll deal with Night by Elie Wiesel, The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, and Mouse by R. Spiegelman. Each of these works provides unique, diverse, wide perspectives and storytelling techniques that can enrich the educational experience. I will shortly present all of these texts, and it will be very short. So The Night by Elie Wiesel is a poignant memoir that delves into the trauma and survival of the Holocaust. Key themes include loss of faith, inhumanity, and cruelty. Symbols such as night representing darkness and loss of hope, and fire symbolizing destruction and death are prevalent. And pedagogically, this book can be used to spark class discussions on moral and ethical dilemmas. For example, we can discuss Weasel's experiences and the choices he faced, encouraging students to reflect on their own values and beliefs. Assigning reflective writing tasks to students can help students process the emotional weight of the text and connect it broader to other ethical questions. The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak explores the power of words in literature, resistance and defiance, and friendships and love in times of war. Symbols like books representing knowledge and power, and colors um, conveying different emotions and experiences are central to the literary piece. Um, Teachers can use this text to analyze the unique narrative perspective, especially the one of death as the narrator. This perspective offers unique way to discuss themes of mortality and the human condition. Creative projects such as book reviews, character diaries, or even creating a scrapbook from the perspective of one of the characters can engage students and deepen their understanding of the themes, text, characters, etc. Next work is the Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. It addresses the themes of redemption, forgiveness, impact of violence and war, as well as social and ethnic divisions. Symbols that we have here are kites, which represent freedom and redemption, and the pomegranate tree, representing childhood and lost innocence. Pedagogically, this novel can be used for comparative analysis with historical events in Afghanistan, allowing students to see the real-world implications of the story. Group discussions on the themes of guilt and atonement can help students explore the complexities of the characters' motivations and actions. Additionally, examining social and ethnic divisions depicted in the book can lead to discussions about similar issues in contemporary society. Last but not least is Mouse by R. Spiegelman. This is a graphic novel, and it depicts the Holocaust through memory and trauma, family and survival. Symbols include mice and masks. Mice represent Jews. Masks are a symbol of identity and disguise. The graphic novel format can be a powerful tool for engaging students visually and emotionally. That's probably the best way to engage students because they mostly react on the photos. Um, Teachers can use visual analysis to explore how the illustrations convey themes and emotions, complementing the text. Uh, Also, discussions on the use of animal metaphors to represent different groups can lead to broader conversations about identity, dehumanization, the way in which we perceive the other, the difference. Next is integrating literature into genocide education curriculum. It involves close reading and textual analysis, interdisciplinary approaches, linking history and literature, and the use of multimedia resources like films and documentaries. This comprehensive approach ensures that students not only understand the historical facts, but also connect with human experiences behind those facts. For example, we can connect the work called Night with documentary footage from the Holocaust, and that can provide a more rounded perspective. Also, using excerpts from survivor testimonies alongside the piece called Mouse can enrich students' understanding of personal narratives. Then fostering critical thinking. Literature is incredible in that. Methods such as Socratic seminars, debates on ethical issues, critical essays, and research projects can be employed. These activities encourage students to engage deeply. With the text, historical context, they represent time and everything. For example, Socratic seminar on the book thief can or might explore questions like what is the role of an individual in resisting tyranny, or how does Zusak use the character of death to comment on the nature of war. Also, we can use activities like role-playing, personal narrative projects, community service, outreach program to help students develop empathy, ethical engagement, to put themselves in the shoes of characters, etc. Challenges and opportunities. Teaching about genocide through literature presents challenges such as sensitivity of the subject matter, diverse student backgrounds and experiences. Currently, I work at the same university I graduated, and I have completely different students and completely different perspectives on one single sentence. Not talking about stories. It would be very challenging to do that. Um, it is essential to approach these topics with care and provide support for students who may find the material distressing. Opportunities of teaching genocide through literature are building a more informed and empathic citizenry and promoting peace and reconciliation. Um, Literature provides a unique entry point for these discussions. It engages students on an emotional level and encourages them to consider the ethical implications of historical events. And in conclusion, literature plays a crucial role in genocide education. Thoughtful and sensitive teaching approaches can harness the transformative power of literature to foster empathy, critical consciousness, ethical engagement among students. By integrating these literary works into the curriculum, educators can help students connect with the human stories behind historical events, encouraging deeper understanding, commitment to preventing future atrocities. And that would be it from me. Thank you very much for listening, and I welcome all of your questions, discussions that you may have.
Have the question and answers after we've listened to all three presentations. So next we are going to say hello to Alexiana who's talking about teaching genocidal religious literature in humanities course. So over to you, Alexiana.
Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Alexiana Frey, as you've already heard. I'm a postdoctoral researcher and teacher at the University of Copenhagen, and I teach mainly on a project in diaspora and situations that envelop and involve diaspora in ancient religious literatures, particularly in ancient Judaism. However, as we know, Hebrew Bible can often sometimes be conflated and confused for, because of similar material, the Old Testament, which is more of a Christian literature. I'm sorry to say that my teammate won't be joining with me today, but she's also amazing. We're still going to fill these 15 minutes, don't you worry. I want to say, for starters, too, it's so exciting for me as an outsider to these conversations that people are having conversations about what it means to involve emotions and ethics in conversation in relation to atrocity. I know this may sound really sad, but these are not conversations that are being had in at least my spheres and my realms of teaching, particularly in religion. So glad to be here. I will say this, though, when I have been looking at some of these pieces involving being aware of emotions, being aware of ethics, so on and so forth, I noticed there was a lack of a discussion involving somewhat of the neurological and stress and trauma things in those spheres. So I'm here to sort of fill that role. I am very, very much in tune with trauma theory as I use it in my own work. And I'm also licensed as a trauma-informed yoga practitioner with some somatic experiencing. So all of that to say, emotions are not something that just come out of nowhere. They are embodied things. So as I've taught in religious contexts, both with folks who are and with folks who are not religious, and sometimes they're all in the same room, I've noticed a really difficult tension and pattern. So often it seems that if you have religious texts that do portray horrific things, you may learn to dissociate, reframe, even justify some of these things in the name of God. And what is even more difficult on a very much so trauma-informed lens is that helping folks to acknowledge these things are in these religious literatures can in and of themselves be traumatizing to folks with those religious backgrounds. And so we have to strike a really, really good balance here because, yes, with every story, we have to also acknowledge that some of these horrific things that we read in these ancient texts can be understood in some light as liberative and not just oppressive. These are complicated texts. However, they still invoke horrific, even sometimes genocidal, blatantly genocidal rhetorics and actions. So taking the time to sift through power structures is also vital and key, especially as these texts are used, were discussed and used in the past and are also being used in the present. It's imperative to recognize power structures, both in the past and in the present, when it comes to these narratives. So how do we teach religious texts that have genocidal rhetoric or actions in them well, especially in mixed religious settings? Because we have such a short amount of time, what I'm going to do is introduce, from a trauma-informed lens, the concept of the window of tolerance in educational settings, as well as the importance of somatics in helping students regulate. I will try not to overload you today. Only 2 slides. Let's do this. So emotions are one thing, but what is happening in the brain when we are processing information? For starters, it's important. I know I'm saying the word trauma and immediately we go off the handle, but ultimately PTSD, things, the word in there, S, is stress. It's not just trauma that induces change in our nervous system, it is stress, okay? So when stress occurs, different things happen in our bodies. We all should, maybe, hopefully, I don't want to should on anybody. We all should know the 5 F alliterations that folks move to in situations of threat or stress. We have fight and flight over here on the hyper arousal section, and we have flight, freeze, fawn, and flop on the other side. What's interesting and is coming out in newer research is that fawning behaviors or appeasing behaviors are actually a hypoarousal, where you turn off interoception. So you turn off awareness of oneself, but you turn on hypervigilance and awareness with others and the situation around you. So there's a sort of a dual activation that's happening there, which is why a lot of us people pleasers are extremely exhausted. Fun fact. However, things right here in this sweet little middle section, this window of tolerance, that's where you want folks to be. That's a really, really beautiful, sweet space where things can happen and you're moving around in this window, but you're still able to maintain a regulated state. Why is this important? Okay. As teachers, it's important that we are aware that students may be coming in already outside of their window of tolerance, okay? Also, they may come from situations and contexts in which their window of tolerance has shrunk so much that it is maybe non-existent. They might live their life in hypo or hyper arousal, completely dysregulated. On the other hand, you can also have a too big of a window of tolerance in which nothing affects you. And again, this is not the goal. The goal isn't to just make people not affected by atrocity. We need to be affected by atrocity, obviously. However, it's important to know these things. These processes are happening in folks' bodies with varying levels of sizes of the window of tolerance. Because when folks are in hyper or hypoarousal, they cannot process or take in any new information. Let me say that again for those of us who are trying to affect change. When students, when ourselves are in dysregulated states, we do not process any new information. We are just consumed with getting out of the stressful, threatening situation. The memes that are going around right now is, you know, I got an email, but why am I trying to leave the room? Like that's a small window of tolerance, right? You know, it's not, you don't need to leave the room because you got a bad email. Anyway, so in states of dysregulation, practitioners actually call that lizard brain because you are immediately moving into a sort of mammalian animal state in which you are very just concerned with your survival. You're not thinking about anything else. It's just, what do I need to do to get out of this situation? So as someone who teaches some of the horrific pieces that are found in Holy Scripture, including genocide, mass rape, enforced displacement, etc., it's important to remember that we also, as practitioners, have those lizard brains as well. And I say lizard brain because what animals do to process and deal with their stress is imperative for us to remember, as we are animals, right? While we are different creatures and there are different tools and resources, I have found it extremely helpful to remember that we all have animal bodies and that we shouldn't be separated. We shouldn't be separating the mind from the body. Okay? So I have found it extremely helpful personally when I am teaching on difficult topics such as genocide, such as war, mass rape, displacement, etc., all things that are in these texts. I've found it extremely helpful to integrate simple somatics in the classroom. Now, this sounds like, oh no, as an educator, another thing I have to learn to do. I promise you, this is not going to be excessive, okay? One can get trained in these things, of which I am, but they really, really are so simple. In fact, you'll notice that if you have infants or toddlers in your life, these are things that these humans do naturally. They just become socialized out of doing them as they need to sit still in the classroom and behave and be behind a desk. It's sad, but it is what it is, okay? We need to stop divorcing our bodies and our minds. And many in trauma theory thus then combine the word to mind body when we are talking about those things, because we have created such a divergent binary rhetoric around those things. So all said, integrating breaks and pauses for folks during your teaching is vital in order to allow people, one, to pay attention to their body. That's called interoception, as you see here on the slide. And that is not something, mainly in capitalistic societies, that they want you to do in general. Taking a quick break, asking yourself and asking students what you're feeling emotionally, and if they feel it somewhere in their body, if they feel like they need to do something about that emotion. Those things are good. And I know that it's hard to integrate even 30-second, 60-second breaks, but that's really all you need. You don't need to do anything beyond, you don't need to add 15-minute huge breaks in order for people to feel their feelings. Help people be there, present in the moment is what we're trying to do, okay? And two, I've already kind of touched on this, but when people are feeling an emotion and you ask them to pay attention to whether or not they feel it somewhere in their body, it's imperative you ask if there's something they want to do in order to move with that. Somatics is movement, right? And it's embodiment. It's a simple way of saying you feel something internally and you need to process it externally via the body. So I have it sort of broken down into 4 different kinds of movements that you can integrate in your classroom. One being orienting. This is connecting students to their senses and helping remind their bodies that while they might not feel safe, because they're taking in a lot of information that is really difficult, it is stressful, right? It is traumatizing. Reminding them that while they might not feel safe, they are in a current container in which they are actually safe. This doesn't involve a ton of movement. It can be done while seated. It can be a simple thing where you tell people, pay attention to your 5 senses. 5 things you see, 4 things you touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. That's it. That took me all of 10 seconds, as I can see on my little clock here, to just run through. And that's it. Integrating people, making sure they are inside of their bodies while they are processing all of this information will help them to continue to process it. Now, grounding. This is as simple as asking students to notice where parts of their body are touching a solid space. That may include their sits bones. That may include their feet. That may include their hands on a desk, right? Taking the time to also ask them if there is a way in which they need to move their body in which they feel more supported is also good. 10 seconds, 15 seconds of a quick break. Feel your body, be in your body. For centering, let your students stretch. They can do this even while they're in a seat, or they can do it while standing. This can also be something where you even ask them to wiggle their body like animals even do after encountering a stressful situation. And then to notice what it feels like to find their balance after they wiggled around so much. This is acknowledging that being in a body and having an animal body is weird, and that's okay. And lastly, breath. To remind people to breathe. I know that, again, this sounds so silly and so simple, but it really is. This is just telling your students quickly, take a breath in through your nose and push it out your mouth. Look at that. We just did a nice clearing breath. That's excellent. You can also do other breath practices. Box breath is a really fantastic one, especially if you're noticing that there are dysregulated states in the classroom, if that's something you're aware of. These are all really easy and accessible things, okay? And as a trauma-informed practitioner, I will always say this outright. Always, always, always preface these movements, or even have them included in your syllabus, or just something that you're acknowledging throughout your time as an educator. Always preface these movements, these things, with an allowance for people to opt out. Agency is the key thing in trauma-informed movements and trauma-informed anything, okay? Agency is vital. I know we may have some time in Q&A, and I hope that my email information is hopefully shared, just in case you have additional questions. I know this is really brief, but this obviously all starts as well with access to care networks. Resilience is not something that you just have as a characteristic of pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality. Resilience is something that's done by communal care and having access to resources and networks of care, okay? And so syllabus, making sure those things are known and accessible for your students is imperative. This also is a reminder that trauma is political, and there's so much to say about that in relation to religion as well. But in my own work, knowing that my students have varying windows of tolerance and I want them to grow, learn, change, and stretch is good.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexiana. So next we have Lucas Meisel, who will be talking about visual media and genocide education.
So thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to talk about some reflections on my experiences working as an educator at European memorial sites dedicated to Nazi victims. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel with a grant from the French Shoah Foundation. But what I'm talking about today is really rooted in my educational work that I did before. What I'd like to do today is talk about visual media and visual sources as tools in educational programs. First, talking about so-called icons or symbolic images and their tensions with visual media as historical sources. Then I'd like to propose an approach in dealing with these tensions between symbolic images and historical sources by going beyond these icons and breaking expectations and raising questions for participants. And lastly, I'd like to talk a bit about potentials of this approach in regard to other genocides and cases of mass atrocities. So first, visually representing genocides between icons and historical sources. What I mean by that is that when participants come to educational programs at memorial sites or in workshop settings or in different educational settings, they often already have certain images and imaginations of genocides that they bring with them. And first of all, a lot of them are rooted in cultural visual depictions. So for instance, the TV series Holocaust from the 1970s, of course, also coined the terminology of the Nazi genocide very much. The same is to some extent true for the film The Killing Fields that became synonymous with the mass atrocity of the Khmer Rouge. And other films are similarly influential in the way how participants in educational programs about genocide think about certain cases of genocide. Hotel Rwanda here, the more recent cases, Quo Vadis Aida, concerning the Srebrenica genocide, and the act of killing about the mass murder of communists or alleged communists in Indonesia. So a lot of participants already have certain images, often rooted in these films or similarly relevant cultural depictions. And these films, of course, are, first of all, films, and they work according to genre conventions. We can argue about if there is actually something like a genocide film or Holocaust cinema, but there are certain tropes that are repeated quite often. Here's just one example from the recently awarded film Zone of Interest that is comparable to some extent to a different approach, but with a similar subject, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, a UK production of 2008. That depicts the life of the family of a Nazi commandant, of the Höss family, of the who lived in the vicinity of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp. And a lot of the ways how these perpetrators or the main perpetrator are depicted are rooted in certain, to some extent, also simplifications of Hannah Arendt's arguments in her book about Adolf Eichmann, based on his trial in Jerusalem. So there are certain tropes that also are connected with these types of film that again also influence how participants in educational programs think about genocide, and in this regard, for instance, concerning the perpetrators. Furthermore, a lot of participants, from my experience, already have a knowledge of certain, as Habuk Knoch, a German historian, calls them symbolic images that seemingly unambiguously transfer certain meanings or lessons from a genocide. We have here the photograph, a well-known photograph taken in the Warsaw Ghetto during the uprising, showing Jewish families and a boy with raised hands. We have here photographs that are prominently shown in the Tulslang memorial site in Phnom Penh, showing identification photographs of Khmer Rouge victims, and also concerning the genocide in Bosnia, often photographs of Serb paramilitaries are shown as illustrations concerning this genocide. So we have certain images that people already know of usually. However, what is usually not part of their knowledge, and this is a starting point for an educational setting, I would argue, is the context of origin of these seemingly unambiguously clear images with clear messages. So, for instance, the photographs from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising were taken by SS photo reporters. The identification photographs in Phnom Penh were taken according to a globalized system of identification that was developed in the 19th century and is still in place in police practices all around the world. And a lot of photographs from Bosnia were actually taken by photojournalists who were in very, very close vicinity to both the perpetrators and the victims. So this context, I think, already opens up challenges and potentials of working with visual material concerning different types of genocide. What I'd like to do now is talk about my approach rooted in my work at memorial sites for Nazi victims. And I think it is important to take all these preconceptions that participants have in mind and start working with them in order to raise questions that go beyond the expectations that participants already bring in an educational setting. So what I'd like to do, and this is just an example, this is also not going to be a role-playing element of the presentation now, but just to give you an illustration of what I think works quite well, is to use, for instance, a photograph like this as an introductory source in a workshop scenario concerning the Mauthausen concentration camp. And I would ask participants to interpret this photograph, and I'd only tell them that it was taken during the existence of the concentration camp. And because the photograph doesn't really have a lot of information and content, and because it also looks not really how you would associate a photograph with a concentration camp, the interpretations are vastly different usually. So people would interpret it as a dead prisoner, or they would interpret it as an SS guard relaxing after his work at the concentration camp. So there's a variety of interpretations very quickly, and people really try to understand the photograph. Usually, and rather quickly, people would also ask if there is any additional information on the backside of the photograph, and as a matter of fact, there is. And the description says that it shows an SS officer, Paul Ricken, who stages the photograph of a dead prisoner. And this information itself is not self-explanatory itself, but raises other questions that don't really help solve understanding the photograph, but raise questions for participants that totally go in a different direction than what they usually would expect from a workshop about a concentration camp. And without going too much into the historical context now, the background of the photograph is that the person lying on the ground was Paul Ricken, an SS photographer who was part of the official SS photo studio at the Mauthausen concentration camp, and each major concentration camp had one of these official photo studios, and SS men would work there in order to document the concentration camp visually. And one central aspect of the work was the creation of police photography that usually consists of identification photographs that would be a link to the Khmer Rouge genocide, for instance, but also so-called crime scenes. This was just the standard part of what these police photography studios would do in general. And they also adapted this in the concentration camp system. So they would take photographs by order of dead prisoners in the vicinity of the camp, alleged suicides or escape attempts, but nevertheless, they would document these murders. They were de facto murders, but they would document them as suicides or escape attempts. So by starting to work with a very obscure looking photograph, we suddenly have a discussion about a legal procedure applied in a concentration camp that resembles police work to some extent. And this raises questions concerning the general design of concentration camps by the Nazis as specific places of confinement and then mass murder and eventually genocide. The description of the photograph on the backside also leads to another dimension that is seldom addressed or too little addressed, and this is a resistance in the concentration camps, because those photographs were usually saved by prisoners, and in this case by Francisco Bosch, a Spanish communist who together with other Spanish communists risked his and their lives to save these photographs and to document the crimes committed on the photographs very toxically by saving photographs that actually were supposed to tell another story. But to summarize this small introduction to this specific case, starting from a photograph that is not what people usually expect, then then encouraging participants to raise their own questions and critically examining the source material can then lead to discussions about, I think, very central aspects of concentration camp history that are usually not even addressed, although they are such essential parts of the camp system that go beyond the image and imagination that people already bring to these educational settings. In general, working at concentration camp memorial sites and also beyond that in workshops that are more situated in what would be seen as Holocaust education, I like to use these types of photographs that break these expectations. For instance, a photograph or a photo album page from the Dachau memorial site, Dachau concentration camp that shows bunny breeding facilities at the concentration camp, a photograph of a prisoner's wedding at the Auschwitz concentration and extermination camp, and half-naked prisoners relaxing on a day off next to a crematorium at the Buchenwald concentration camp. So all of these photographs are exactly not what Habuk Knoch would describe as symbolic images or icons. To move on to the third part, I think that deciphering images and working on source material usually, from my experience, really stimulates discussions that on the one hand relate to the bigger topic, but on the other hand also is rooted in the visuality of the medium that you work with. And I think there is a lot of potential in using visual media in that regard concerning teaching about genocides. So for instance, a lot of genocides or cases of mass atrocities are dominated today by illustrations and documentations through the lenses of perpetrators. And this is, of course, a challenging aspect when teaching about them, because these visual perpetrator narratives are so prevalent. And I think visual art as counter images to these visual narratives by perpetrators are essential in order to understand not only the victim's experience, but also the not objective characteristics of perpetrator photographs. So I think the integration of visual art can be very helpful in that regard. And these are not just a few examples. Of course, the case of Bosnia raises significant questions about the role of bystanders, if you want to call them like that. In this case, the photojournalists, the photo reporters who were so close to the atrocities and became part of the social environment, so to speak, of the genocide. And I think, and also from my experience, the question of what is the role of a photographer in an educational setting opens up also debates and discussions that are very fruitful in general and in regards to photography, but also about the specific cases. And then concerning the internet and the digital age in which we are here, two examples of crime photographs that are very prevalent in social media. Of course, we know about the visual campaigns by the self-proclaimed Islamic State of promoting executions and murders they committed. And we also have from different groups, this is now from Hamas, the first-person perspective of the murder of civilians that is propagated online. And I think for educators, this is prevalent not only when we talk about, in this case, religious genocidal groups, but in general, because participants bring these images in discussions about other genocides as well. And it needs to be addressed that there is also this digital aspect of visual material that really dominates, especially the interest amongst young participants of educational programs. So to conclude, I think in general, visual media and visual sources have a huge potential in instigating discussions, debates, critical examination of source material, critical examination also of the genocidal setting of a crime, and need to be taken seriously as sources in that regard. I think it's important to understand that participants already bring images and imaginations of genocides, especially in cases that are part of the cultural, the context from which they're coming from, and going beyond these expectations really engages them in discussions that I think are the most important potential of using visual media, especially in the digital age, in teaching about genocides.
So three really interesting and different perspectives on genocide education. We don't have any questions at the moment in Q&A, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I guess I'd start off with a question to Ajla. How did you choose the books that you've discussed? What the sort of the metrics that you have for choosing them?
Well, I tried to use books from different parts, different stories, different not genocides, but wars, different stories presented in the texts. That was the only way to choose the books.
Okay, so what sort of search parameters did you have? Were they, like some of the books, are quite well known. So how did you actually come up with the list?
To be very honest, my professor of literature suggested them to discuss, and I tried to read all of them and to get informed about the books. So it was my professor's suggestion.
Okay, and how many books were suggested?
7.
Right. Okay. I just wondered because there's some sort of like interesting choices, and that's why I wondered, what were the sort of like.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Do any of the other panelists have a question? I'm just looking now. What was I'm trying to read. Oh yes, mine was for Alexiana. When you're talking about, sort of like these like centering practices and grounding practices, what sort of the ages of the students that you're dealing with?
Yeah, I actually teach in undergraduate and graduate studies. But I will say that a lot of these simple tools can also be used in elementary schools. It might get a little bit more silly in elementary schools, so there might be need to be a little bit more frameworks around them, but I have used them explicitly in undergraduate settings and graduate settings, and I was actually nervous in integrating them, thinking that people would think it was ridiculous. And for the most part, I've never experienced a situation in which somebody doesn't do it. And I've never experienced a pushback in any sort of way. People are very receptive, which is really lovely.
So do you explain it to them, like in the first seminar, do you explain what's going to happen, and then you repeat that in subsequent seminars? It's like
here and there. Yeah. So I do make it pretty clear in like syllabi, but if I am even a guest lecturer, I just, from the get-go, hi, this is my background, this is my experience. You may notice that I add a few things into our time together that are maybe interesting or out of the ordinary for a typical classroom setting, but I promise you, I have your best interest in mind, and this is where it comes from. And you have all freedom and flexibility to opt out of doing what I lead you in, right?
Okay.
So, but if it is a full class that I'm teaching like over the semester, it's in the syllabus, it's repeated. Yeah.
And how many do you have in the seminar? How many students?
I have done this in seminars between, I've had about 100 students at one time, and
Right.
they all stood up and shook their bodies out, which was incredible. And yes, there's a little bit of laughter because it's just like, this doesn't happen in a classroom, especially one where we're talking about dismemberment. So in classroom settings of over 100 I've done this, but also in a more intimate 20 to 30 people, even smaller, like 8 people I've done it with. So
Okay.
it's good.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
The next question is for Lucas. Maureen is asking, could you say she wasn't sure if you said something about the photographer staging the pictures, or did she hear incorrectly?
Yeah, so to make it brief, in general, the idea in the concentration camp was that when an unnatural death occurred, which was a suicide or an escape attempt, for instance, the SS photographer would come and document the crime scene in order to create proof that the guards responsible for the shooting acted according to law. So this was basically the general idea. And we know from survivor testimonies that a lot of these photographs were actually staged. So that an SS guard would shoot a prisoner for whatever reason, and then they would rearrange the scene, bring the photographer, and then take these pictures in order to create fake evidence for the rightfulness of their deeds. And this, of course, raises a lot of questions of why the perpetrator saw a need to do that within the Nazi state. And this I can't really explain now, but this I think is a core element of understanding this legality, if you want to call it like that, of the crimes committed within the concentration camp system.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucas. We then, another question for you. Could you please discuss the importance of making responsible choices in the classroom when we're sharing images with students?
This is a tough question, of course. I think in general, it's challenging to talk about topics like genocide or mass violence in its various forms in an educational setting. This already is to some extent a contradiction because we don't want to overwhelm participants, but we kind of need to when we address these topics. And I think addressing this dilemma is already a first step in raising questions connected to it. So what I would usually do is to talk about this directly, and also talk about that there are certain images that I don't want to share. And then we can talk about these images, not necessarily by showing them, but by making certain topics graspable, is the word actually, so make it understandable that that it is tough to teach about these topics and not only to learn about them. So for instance, cases of sexual violence are very graphically depicted in testimonies without any images, but it is also doubtful if this is something that students, for instance, should be exposed to. But on the other hand, it is necessary to talk about sexual violence because it is such a crucial aspect of genocides. And I think starting to talk about it on a meta level works quite well, because I think that makes also students usually understand also these tensions, I think. And usually I don't choose photographs that show violence directly, but that they come from a violent context. And this is what I want to convey usually.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question for Alexiana. Could we hear more about how your work is tied to biblical references?
Yeah. So it's a little multifaceted in that when I deal with ancient text, especially, I have to recognize that those texts are coming from a context, and that context in and of itself is probably imbued with a lot of trauma, with power differential, so on and so forth. And so there is something called actually trauma hermeneutics, in which I reread the text through a lens of trauma and see, is there something else that I should be aware of, so on and so forth. As it pertains to horrific depictions, then we have to sort of see it on a myriad of layers, right? Is there something in that context that's being symbolically represented through this act? But also, what does this rhetoric do, even if it is taken literally? And so there's a lot of different facets involved when it comes to a sort of trauma-informed lens of reading. And as I'm sure we are all aware too, like even a trauma-informed lens, it's extremely empathetic. We have to also be aware that just because we're being empathetic and trauma-informed doesn't condone specific behaviors or rhetorics, et cetera, et cetera. So just keeping all of that in mind is really hard, because it's not necessarily a binary, like this is good, this is bad. It's more gray and nuanced, and it's difficult to be in that space, but it's good.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if that helps.
Another question for Lucas. It's quite a long one. I read a caption in a book beneath the famous photo of a boy in Warsaw claiming that he survived the Holocaust and became a successful businessman. I'm not aware there was any basis for this claim. Is this sort of claim common in relation to Holocaust photos? And if so, what do you think lies behind it? So that's for Lucas, quite a tough question.
Yeah, so to my knowledge, there are a few people who thought to see themselves, recognize themselves from this photograph, or other people who seem to have thought that they recognized someone they knew. And this is very typical for symbolic images, pictures that become these illustrations that are supposedly the one image of a genocide. And as far as I know, this is also not only true for the Holocaust. I don't know of any that any of these claims are actually based on any other evidence. I don't think that people deliberately told not the truth, but it's a way of how these photographs also serve as images where you can tell your own story. And in that regard, it's they see themselves in that and they can tell a story about it, but it doesn't mean that it's actually them, if that makes sense. As far as I know, no one survived from this group of Jews because they were afterwards directly deported to Treblinka, and there was no way of surviving that. Basically, no way.
Okay, thank you. A question to Alexiana again. Can you share any specific examples or case studies where students' engagement with the genocidal themes in the Hebrew Bible led to transformative learning moments?
Yes. Hi. Yes. How much time do we have?
Well, we've got quite a few questions still to come in. So if you
Yeah.
otherwise, I would suggest people maybe contact you directly afterwards.
I'm totally fine with that. I will try to keep this short and sweet. Not sweet. That's a terrible way to put this. So I personally, my own dissertation was surrounded by there is a specific passage that I work with, and just to be very blunt about the violence in it, enslaved woman is experiences multiple perpetrator rape and then is subsequently dismembered. And there is a reading of this in which it is done in specific context in which the authors would have experienced exile and diaspora. And so there is a reading of this that I do through a trauma-informed lens in which I see this woman's body as the social body, as she is, and just to be very explicit, sorry in advance, she is raped through war. This is a symbol, and dismembered into diaspora, right? And so this is the image that they are trying to share about how they feel about these experiences. However, to hold that and to go, wow, that is such great deep pain, and also this is horrible and horrific, does this kind of language and rhetoric, could this kind of language and rhetoric mean actual literal violence for enslaved women in those settings as well, right? And so to hold both of those in your hands and to see that there's many things going on in literature, right? In literature in general, for students, that is very much mind-opening, because I am not here to say that folks can't be religious, right? I'm not, but you have to be honest about what is in your religious text. You have to be honest about what is in your religion and the things you believe, and if it inspires harm to others, and to name it and to deal with it, and to still yet you can still be faithful, and right. So all that said, that's just one example of many that I work with.
Okay,
a lot of the work Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's just we've still got two
Yeah.
more questions, and you gave you gave one example that was very telling, and thank you. I'm going to have to stop the questions now, so don't post any more. I'm just going to go to Lucas. How concerned would you be of bias in sharing pictures? For example, sharing atrocity pictures of one side and not the other.
It's an intriguing question. For instance, in the Bosnian case, this is something that came up a few times. So when I talk about the Srebrenica genocide of Muslims by Serbs, and I'm now situated in Vienna, and a lot of survivors from the wars in the 90s live in Vienna. So when you talk about this specific case, it's not a neutral ground where I am right now. So when I focus on Srebrenica, for instance, and of Muslim victims, people might see it as a bias to not talk about victims by Croatian militias, for instance. And I think you need to start somewhere. So because the Srebrenica genocide, I think, is especially intriguing because of the role of the UN, and that the UN didn't intervene in the murder of these Muslims. I think it is, from an educational perspective, something that helps understand the wars in the 90s. But it doesn't mean that I don't want to talk about, for instance, the continuation of fascist ideology in Croatia after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, for instance. But I think if especially participants bring up these other aspects of something in as well, and if you address it also that you need to start somewhere, you need to open up the discussion from there. It works best if you provide an environment where you can talk about various cases at the same time, and let also to some extent the participants direct the setting.
Okay, thank you very much.
So,
We've now reached the end of the session.